Hello, everyone, and welcome to API Development and Testing with Wiremock-Captain. Uh, let's start with a very quick introduction. So I'm Satvik Shukla. I'm a developer here at HBO Max. I'm also the co-creator and maintainer of Wiremock-Captain. On most days, I'm looking into in-app purchases and subscriptions, trying to figure out the best ways to make the HBO Max platform better for our end users. I'm most accessible through Twitter and GitHub. And in case there are any questions that do pop up that we are not able to get to before the end of this talk, feel free to engage me over on one of those platforms. So with that, let's quickly jump and see what we will be covering over the next 45 minutes. So we'll start by quickly learning a little bit about Wiremock-Captain, what it is, and where does it fit in. Once we are done with that, we'll jump on to some of the use cases as to how Wiremock-Captain would fit into everyday the developer experience. After that, we will do some live coding walkthroughs. So we will jump right into code and see how anyone can utilize Wiremock-Captain to do API development and testing. And once we are done with that, we will also have some of the more complex examples that Wiremock-Captain can be used for that we won't be covering in our code walkthrough, but we will be just going over them in very high level brief in kind of the fourth section. And finally, we will have a Q&A section where I will try to answer any and all the questions that do come up as we are going through the talk. So as far as the questions goes for the session, feel free to put the questions in the chat. And towards the end of the session, I will try to answer all of them. With that, let's learn about Wiremock-Captain. But before learning about Wiremock-Captain, it is important for us to understand what Wiremock is. So Wiremock is a mock server or an HTTP API simulator in Java. It has been widely used across industry for years, across companies to make testing and API development better. Using Wiremock specifically has allowed developers to have high level of confidence in the code they ship, which is sometimes hard to achieve without having such mature tools and ecosystem. So how does Wiremock-Captain fit into all of this? Wiremock-Captain provides developers with a TypeScript-based abstraction to make use of Wiremock's functionalities. The documentation and the interface for Wiremock-Captain are structured such that there is no need for anyone to have prior experience or knowledge of Wiremock. What this allows users is to stand up mock servers and configure it through TypeScript or JavaScript code to return different HTTP responses. The library has seen consistent feedback since its inception around a year back, and we just had the latest major release this past week. So with that, let's jump into some of the use cases as to where does Wiremock-Captain fit in into the everyday routine of a developer. So the first scenario is during the API development phase. So suppose we have to write an application that interacts with Spotify APIs to get us information about an artist, like their name, their popularity, the genres of the songs that they create, and so on and so forth. It is fairly clear how the application would work out in the real world, right? It should be sending requests to the Spotify APIs, and using the response we get back from the Spotify APIs, we would render the final response to our application. But what about when the application is not out in the real world and facing those real user traffic? We might not want to call the Spotify APIs as we are doing our development locally, or we might not have access to the Spotify APIs, because to get that, you have to set up a developer account, you need to have the right access credentials, and so on and so forth. So in all such scenarios and other similar ones, where we do not want to block our development on the presence and access to the Spotify APIs, we can leverage Wiremock-Captain. So with the help of Wiremock-Captain, we can set up mock servers that we will be calling into instead of the real Spotify API during the development phase, and thereby increasing our overall productivity. So what you see in the diagram here is in the production environment, which is basically your application that is facing the real user traffic, we would be calling to the Spotify API, which is hosted at spotify.api.com. But when we are in the development phase, when the environment is set to development, which is locally, let's say, we would, instead of calling into the Spotify API, we would call into a mocked server that we have created and configured locally. And what this allows us is to basically do our development independent of the presence of a Spotify API, which would be available to us in the production environment. Jumping on to the second use case. So now the second use case for Wiremock-Captain is when we use it during the testing phase. Now that we are done with the development, we want to test out the code that we wrote. We can call the real Spotify API during our test, but that would not allow us to test out all the different user scenarios. Because what if the Spotify API that we are trying to test is down? How does our application handle our external APIs that we are calling into being out of service or responding with bad data and all these different error cases that you cannot expect, right? So just like the development phase, we are going to set up a mock server that is going to respond with different responses. And some of them would be, let's say, successful responses, but we can also configure our server to respond back with bad responses. And by bad responses, we are talking about 401 status code, unauthorized requests, status code with 500, the internal server error. So anytime the external API is not able to respond successfully, we can test out how our application will deal with all those scenarios. So as you can see in this diagram, we are going to use the external mock server to configure not only successful request response schemas, but also request response schemas in which we get back error responses. So with that, let's look at this very basic hello world kind of an example of how does one use and set up Wiremock-Captain. So this is these 18 or so lines of code is basically all you need to configure a Wiremock-Captain mock server and set it up and have some API running on it. So on line 3, we are creating a mock server instance pointing to the location of the Wiremock instance that is running, right? Then on line 5 through 11, we are configuring what that incoming request should look like. So we are saying that incoming request should be a GET request, and the endpoint for it should be /API endpoint, and it should have a body, which is hello world, right? Then on line 12 through 15, we are configuring a mock response that has to be returned back, right? So we are saying that we want to return back a status code of 200 along with a body of goodbye world JSON. So finally, once we have these right request and response objects, we will use that initial instance of the mock server that we created on line 3 and call the register method on that, which is going to register this request response against the mock. So what all these lines of code are actually doing is, if now we were to make a call to localhost 8080 port /API endpoint API with the body hello world, we will receive back a response with status code of 200 and the response body being goodbye world. So with that kind of very basic use case out of the way, let's quickly do a walkthrough of the couple of use cases of Wiremock-Captain. So the code I would be going through is available on the Wiremock-Captain GitHub repository inside the examples directory. So with that, let me quickly switch our screens. Okay. So here, okay. So what we are looking at here is that application we were talking about where we are calling into Spotify's API, right? So just to walk through our application, what we are doing. So the first thing, we are creating an Express server, which is the famous node package that helps us to create applications, web-based applications. What we are doing then is we are creating this artist popularity API on our server that is going to render back a response. So what does this response, or what are we doing in this API specifically? We are getting the Spotify server's URL, which is just api.spotify.com. We are getting the API that we want to call into, which is /v1 artist along with the artist ID, right? So before proceeding further, why don't we take a look at what does this API look like? So this is the documentation for the Spotify API that we are going to be talking to and trying to play with during this presentation. So as you can see, this is a get artist API, where if you make a call to api.spotify.com /artist/ID, you will receive a response that looks something like this. So you will have an artist name, you will have some popularity score, you will have the genres for that artist, relating to the music the artist makes, and followers, and so on and so forth. So we would be basically playing along with the interactions with this API, right? So now looking back at our code, this is our Spotify API server, and this is the exact API that we are talking to. Once we are done with that, here is our access token. So not anyone can call into the Spotify API. To do so, you need to set up a developer account and set up the right credentials to be able to do so. So access token is basically a way of doing authentication or authorization for the Spotify API. So once we do have the access token, we are going to just call into the Spotify API, make a GET request, and from that GET request response, we are going to get the data. And from that return data, we are going to get the artist name, popularity, and genres, right? And finally, we are going to respond back with a 200 status code and the artist info, right? So now, how does this all look? So for that, let's quickly run through this example. So now, as you can see, we have this log artist popularity API is now running at localhost artist popularity 8080. Now, if we go to our web browser and make a GET request, you see this responded back with a JSON, which is artist name is Pitbull, artist popularity score is 87, and the genres relating to the artist are dance, pop, Latin, and so on and so forth. So this is all great, right? We are able to now call into the Spotify API when we do want to, and kind of, this would be our final application. But as we are doing development, what if we do not have access to the Spotify API? What if we have not set up our developer account that would allow us to have this right access token? Or what if we do not want to call into the Spotify API for local development, right? What if we just want to have something running locally that we can call into to make our development process quicker and faster, right? So for that, this is where Wiremock-Captain would come in. So all we would do here is, let's say we are going to create a new function called setup Wiremock instance. And inside this, we are going to set up our Wiremock server, right? So we do not want to be setting up our Wiremock instance when we are dealing with production traffic, right? But only when we are doing development locally. So the first thing we do is we get our environment that we are running on. So this should get us the environment. So in case the environment is equal to development, which is basically going to signify that only if we are doing development locally, let us go ahead and create. So first of all, let's create the mock instance, right? So we will go ahead, create this Wiremock instance at http://localhost 8085, right? So this will create that new mock instance. Okay. Once we are done with this, we are going to set up our mock with the write request and the response schemas, right? So what should the request look like? The request is going to be a GET request, and the API we would be calling to is the Get Art Spotify Artists API, right? So we would be making a GET request to the same API that Spotify has. So it's not going to be a different API that we are going to be mocking against, right? And as far as the response goes, we are going to say, hey, we want, if there is a request that is made to, actually, let me quickly fix the error. So if there is a request, incoming request to this mock against this specific API, we want it to respond back with a status of 200. In addition, we also want to have some response body, right? Because as we were looking at, this is the example response example that the Spotify API is going to respond back with. So what we are going to do is I have copied over that file that we were just looking at inside this directory. So as you can see, this is the same JSON that we were looking at in Spotify's documentation. So we are going to import this file. So import So we are going to import this file, and we are going to say, hey, that we want to respond back with this JSON if there is an incoming request to this mock instance, right? So now we have set up our mock instance. So that is great. Now what we will do is we are going to call our setup function once the service is going to start up. So if the environment is development, we are going to create a mock instance and set up a mock. If my environment is not development, we are just going to skip over that step. But there's one additional change that we need to make, right? Because as you can see right now, we are calling the get Spotify server URL returns api.spotify.com. So no matter if we have a mock instance or if we do not have a mock instance, we are going to always call into api.spotify.com. But we want to call into api.spotify.com or the actual API only during production, right? So we are going to say that, hey, only if my environment, So only if my environment is production, right? Let's use that as so only if my environment is production, let's use that. Otherwise, let's use the local host, which would have a Wiremock instance that's up and running, right? So if my environment is development, we are going to set up a Wiremock instance and also use that same instance instead of the actual Spotify API. If our environment is production, we won't be setting up any Wiremock instance and we would be using the actual Spotify API, right? So now all of this is, let me just make sure. Okay, so now let's go ahead and run our server, but this time we will run it in development mode. So let's try to run that and see what happens. So now again, we see that same line. We have our artist popularity API running on port 8080/artist popularity. Now let's go back to our API response from before. And if we were to reload this, Now you see the artist name is mock artist, popularity is 10, and genres are basically progressive rock, right? And this all is coming back from this JSON, right? That we kind of have locally and that we have mocked for. So right now, Spotify API is returning this piece of data that we are then using for our development, right? So this is how, even without having access to the actual Spotify API, but by just knowing the fact that what would the request and the response look like, we can go ahead, go forward with our development and not be blocked on that. And this would allow us to not only mock kind of just one use case, but we can create mocks for as many different use cases as we do want, right? Now, once we are done with this, let's look at the second use case. How do we use Wiremock during the testing phase, right? So now we are done with the development part, and now we want to write some tests to make sure that the code that we have written is good, right? It handles all the different scenarios that possibly can come up. So this is what a test written in TypeScript using Jest would look like. So what we have here, we have two tests, right? And to go over these tests individually, this first test, we are trying to check for the fact if the Spotify API is up and running, right? So I will skip over the mocking part, but if the Spotify is up and running and we make a request to our artist popularity API, we should get back a 200 response. And in that response, there should be an artist name, artist popularity, artist genres, and artist genres should not only be defined, but it should be an array that has a length greater than 0, right? And in that other scenario where the Spotify API is not working to expectation, for example, in this case, it is responding back with a status code of 401, right, which is unauthorized. So in that case, if we were to call our artist popularity API and Spotify API was responding back with a 401 status code, even our API should respond back with a 401 status code, and it should respond back with a message that looks like, hey, Spotify API errored out with status code 401, right? So this is what basically the response should look like in case the Spotify API is down and responding back with 401, for example. So these are the two test cases. Now, if we were to kind of run our server first, because we need our server to be up and running to run our tests, right? Because at the end, we are calling our API locally, the artist popularity API. So in one window, in one terminal instance on the left, you see I've started our server in the prod environment. And now if we were to go ahead and run our test, what you will see is we are going to successfully pass one of the tests, but fail the other one, right? So you see one of the tests passed while the other one failed. So we successfully passed the one where Spotify API is up and running, right? Because we had just looked at that example that we were getting back Pitbull with the right popularity score and so on and so forth. But when we tried to test for this other scenario where the API should return 401, we were not able to replicate that scenario because the Spotify API again returned back with a 200 status code. As you can see, we were expecting back a 401 status code, but we received back a 200, right? So now how do we test for all these non-successful scenarios through Wiremock-Captain? That is what we will look at. So that's where Wiremock-Captain would now come in, is we won't call into the actual Spotify API because we cannot dictate to the Spotify API that, hey, we want you to return back an error response, right? So we will use instead a Wiremock instance to create these mocks that we are looking for, right? So now we will create the mock. So now kind of going back to the test, what we are doing in this first test is we are saying, hey, on this mock server, again, that we have defined up here on line 8, we want to register a request, a GET request coming to this API, and we want to respond back with a 200 status code and this body. The same thing that we had done earlier on in these lines, right? So this is basically what we have already looked at. This is the successful API, Spotify API in work, right? But for this other scenario, we are saying that, hey, now when there is a GET request to this specific API, we want the Spotify API to respond back with a 401 status code. We don't want it to respond back with a 200 status code with the information about the artist, but we want it to respond back with a 401 status code, right? So now that we are running our kind of server in a development mode, and now if we try to run our server, let's see what happens. And it failed again, right? So why did it fail now? So the first one, again, the first test passed, right? Because it was working according to expectation. But the second test failed. And you can see the reason it failed is because we did not receive a response back from our API. So as you can see, by kind of creating the right mocks for these different scenarios, we have figured out the fact that, hey, there is some problem with our application code. Because for this scenario where the Spotify API is responding back with a 401 status code, we waited for 5 seconds, but we still were not able to get a response from our API. So what one would do now as a developer is try to figure out what we are doing incorrectly in our application, right? And what we are doing incorrectly in here is if we go back to our API itself, right? So if we look at line 26 through 45, we have kind of all this code where we are talking to the Spotify API, getting the response back and using it to respond back with a 200 status code. But what if there is an error during any of these stages, right? As we are kind of going through any of these steps, what if there is an error? What happens? And that is what happened, because when Spotify's API responded back with a 401 status code, this piece of code on line 32 errored out. And we were no longer able to get to line 45, which would have eventually responded back with the 200 status code and the JSON body, right? So now that we have figured out the error, what we are going to do is figure out how do we fix it, right? So we will fix it by using the conventional or the commonly used try catch mechanism. So if everything works out, right? So in the try block of it, we are going to create the API and return back the right response. So if everything is working fine, there should be no issues, right? But in case there is an error, we have to handle it explicitly now, right? So in case there is an error, we try to handle it explicitly. So Spotify API error status code, right? So in case, let me quickly type it out, and then, right? So what is basically this Spotify API error status code? It's basically the variable that is going to hold the value that comes back from that Spotify's HTTP request, right? So be it 401, be it 403, be it 500. In case there is ever an error, our Spotify API error status code variable is going to have that value, right? And if it is defined, it basically means the Spotify API errored out. But if it is not defined, if it is undefined or let's say null, what that indicates is there was a problem at some point else in our code. Basically, it says that it means line 33 was not the culprit or the line where our code errored out on, but it was someplace else, right? So we need to handle these two scenarios individually. So now what we are doing here is we are saying that, hey, if the Spotify API errored out, we want to respond back with the same error code that Spotify API responded back to us with, right? And we are going to say that, hey, Spotify, and in the message, we are going to say Spotify API errored out with status code. And we are going to just append the status code, right? So in case there is an error from the Spotify API, we are going to, so we are going to use this. But in case there was an error at some place else in our code, we are going to say, hey, in that case, let's respond back with a 500 status code, which is basically this generic status code in case there is an internal server error. So we are just going to respond back with a 500 status code and just say, okay, in that case, there was some internal server error, right? So now let's kind of stop our server. Let's rerun our server. And once we have done that, so now the server is up and running in the development environment, and we have configured it hopefully to handle the scenarios where the Spotify API is erroring out correctly. So now let's rerun our tests, and hopefully looks like it failed again. Just give me 1 second. So we're still facing the same issue. For sake of time, let me quickly jump on to the final code, which looks like the same. So this is the final code for that, where we are getting the response.status. And if there is an external error status code, we are going to respond back with that. And if there is not, we are going to respond back with a 500 status code, right? So let's quickly, just 1 second. So instead of using our development script, let's use this final version. And now let's try to rerun the test. And boom. So we are basically calling, or we were now able to successfully mock out the scenarios where the Spotify API was responding back with 401. And now even our application was able to handle that scenario, and we were able to write tests for that successfully. So as you can see, during the development phase and also during the testing phase, we were able to use Wiremock-Captain to test out for all the different error and successful scenarios. So with that, let's quickly jump back to the slides and walk through some of the more complex examples where we can use Wiremock-Captain. So this first example here, this is how we would configure Wiremock to match based on query parameters. So on line 4 through 6, we specify the query parameters we expect from that incoming request. Then on line 13 to 17, we specify that we are looking for a country to be equal to France for the mock to match. And then on line 20, we finally register the mock. So this kind of matching is really helpful when we are trying to match against query parameters, request headers, cookies, and so on and so forth, right? Kind of this next scenario is, it is quite frequent when you are creating REST APIs to have resource IDs in the path parameters, right? So you can have something like student / the random generated student ID as part of your path parameter for the API that you are working with. So in that case, you can also do a regex match for your API. So it does not have to match exactly, but it can instead be a regex match. So on line 4, in this example, we are defining the regex for our endpoint. And on line 10, we are specifying that, hey, do not check that my endpoint is exactly equal, but instead check for it being a regex equality instead of a normal equality, string equality, right? And then on line 13, we finally register our mock. Walking through a kind of couple of more examples, this one being kind of a more important use case, which is specifying stub priority. So now let's say what we are doing here, this looks kind of involved, but what we are doing in this code snippet is we are configuring 2 different mocks, right? So through on lines 1 through 12, we are configuring the first mock where any request made to the get API endpoint will respond back with a 401 status code with a body saying that error unauthorized, right? And then we are specifying that mock a priority of 2, as you can see on line 9, right? And then we finally register it on line 12. The next time we are doing something really similar, we are mocking for a request to the same endpoint, a get request to API endpoint. But this time we are saying that, hey, there should be an authorization header that should start with something like bearer, right? So we are saying that in addition to kind of it being a get request to this API, it should also have a authorization header that looks like this. And on line 25 through 30, you can see we are specifying or giving that a stub priority of 1. So for any request that comes through that matches the first mock, right? That only matches the first mock, we will return back a 401 status code, right? So if there is an incoming request that does not have authorization header, we will return 401 status code because that is the mock it matched against. But in case there is an incoming request that has an authorization header, it will match both the mocks. But because the second mock has a higher priority, so 1 is higher than 2. So basically, if a request matches against both the mocks, or there can be even more than 2, right? There can be 10 different mocks. But basically, for all the mocks that the request is matching, whatever mock is returned back is going to be the one with the highest priority, right? So this is helpful for testing some of the kind of edge cases scenarios. And finally, you can also configure your responses to respond back with some delay. So in case you want to test out how does my application handle the logic where Spotify API is taking, let's say 3 to 6 seconds to respond back with, or it always takes 10 seconds to respond back with, right? So to look into those scenarios of socket timeouts and network delays and so on, you can configure, as you can see on line 9 through 15, we are saying that configuring a uniform delay between 3000 and 5000 milliseconds for this mock. So again, this is another of the more complex examples, and there are many more that I would be skipping or not going over as part of this conversation, but the examples are there in the GitHub repository of Wiremock-Captain. And they include using webhooks, stateful mocks, having binary responses for things like protobuf support, and so on and so forth. So that are basically some of the more complex examples that we can leverage Wiremock-Captain to achieve. And with that, I think it's finally time for the Q&A section. I do have some like frequently asked questions already in here. In case we run out of questions from the audience, we can go over this, but now I can take any of the questions that might have come up.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm not seeing any questions in Q&A or in chat at the moment. So maybe you could go through some of the FAQs that you have.
Great. Okay, so let's start with the first one, which is, I think, the most common question that I've received, which is how is Wiremock-Captain different from the other mocking solutions that exist? So Wiremock-Captain offers out-of-process mocks. And to kind of explain that a little bit further, some of the other solutions that do exist out there are trying to intercept that outgoing request. So when our application is calling the Spotify API, some of the in-process mock mechanism is trying to intercept that external outgoing request. And by intercepting it, it will try to now respond back with some response body that has been configured. But Wiremock-Captain does not behave like that. So Wiremock-Captain does out-of-process mocks where we have our kind of mock instance completely separate, and we are configuring our mock instance to respond back with a certain response. So we are never intercepting any external requests. The requests are still being made like they would be in kind of production to the Spotify API. But just instead of using the actual Spotify or the production APIs, we are now using mocked instances of those APIs. So it differs basically from many of the libraries in the notion of how mocks work basically, because at the end of the day, we are still using servers. Like there is no typical mocking that is happening. You are still making a request and you're still receiving a response that is not getting intercepted at any point. You are just pointing to a different server instance, if that makes sense. I do see something in the chat. Okay, sorry. Now, how or can Wiremock-Captain be only used to develop and test Node.js APIs? And kind of an emphatic no, right? Because Wiremock-Captain is a tool that you can use to develop and test HTTP APIs, right? So you can have your HTTP APIs written in any language, be it like Java, be it TypeScript and kind of JavaScript using Node.js, and even be it something that's even like more performant and lower level like Rust, right? And you can have your application logic written in any of those languages. But if you want to develop and test, you can still use Wiremock-Captain, but all you would have to do is basically that piece of code will live individually, right? So just like your in normal application code, we have our source folder and the test folder, right? Your source folder, let's say, can be any language of your choice, like Python or Java, Rust, or even Node.js. But our test folder that is using to write basically tests, we can use TypeScript along with Wiremock-Captain to write tests for all those different scenarios, right? So having Node.js APIs is by no means a requirement for that. And there already exists an example in the community of someone using Wiremock-Captain to test out their Rust server. So that is great to see. And then I think the last one is how extensible is Wiremock-Captain? Like when it comes to adding or supporting new features, how does Wiremock-Captain handle that? So, and the response for that, it is quite extensible. And that comes from the fact it does not reinvent the wheel, or it is not creating the new features it is supporting by itself. Most of the times, all it is doing is exposing Wiremock's capabilities, but through kind of its own API, right? So we do not need to basically go back and kind of start from scratch, but all we need to figure out, hey, Wiremock already supports this. Now, how do we provide a TypeScript interface to utilize or make use of these capabilities? And with that, I still think there are no questions from the audience. But I think with that, that was all for the conversation today. So yeah, thank you everyone. And here's my Twitter handle. In case there are any questions that do come up, feel free to reach out to me here, or you can also start some issues in the Wiremock-Captain repository if there are features that are missing, or if there is a bug that you come across or anything else.